Walk into a cigar shop in London and ask for a Partagas. You'll be handed a cigar in a red and gold band, made in Havana, in a factory that has been producing under that name since before the American Civil War. Now fly to Miami. Walk into a shop there and ask for exactly the same thing. You'll also be handed a cigar in a red and gold band, almost the same design, almost the same colors, the same name printed across the front. But it wasn't made in Cuba. It was made in the Dominican Republic. It's built from completely different tobacco. It tastes nothing like the first one. And here is the part that confuses almost everyone who discovers it. Neither of them is a fake. Neither of them is a knockoff. Both of them have a legitimate, documented, unbroken claim to that name, going back to the same man, in the same city, in the same year. One brand, two countries, 2,000 kilometers apart, both real. How does that happen? The answer isn't a story about trademark law. It's a story about what a family loses when a government takes everything, and what turns out to be impossible to take. It begins with a teenager stepping off a boat. In 1831, a boy from Catalonia arrived in Cuba. He was about 15 years old. His father had been a tailor. He had no land, no money, and no connections in the tobacco business. What he did next matters, because it explains everything that came after. He didn't go into an office, he went into the fields. He worked in the Vuelta Abajo, the strip of western Cuba where the finest tobacco in the world grows. He worked under the sun and through the rain. He traveled with the tobacco transports, which in those days were neither safe nor comfortable.
He learned what fermented leaf smells like when it's ready and what it smells like when it isn't. For 14 years, he learned tobacco with his hands. And then, in 1845, he opened his own factory in Havana. He called it the Royal Tobacco Factory, not out of modesty. His customers included nobility across Europe, and he wanted the name to say so. But the ambition wasn't the interesting part. Plenty of men in Havana had ambition. What separated Jaime Partagás from everyone around him was that he refused to accept that the way tobacco had always been handled was the way tobacco should be handled. Consider fermentation. Every cigar you have ever smoked passed through it. Harvested leaf is stacked into enormous piles. The mass of it generates its own heat. Moisture moves, pressure builds, and inside that pile, the chemistry of the tobacco changes. Harshness burns away, ammonia lifts off, sweetness and aroma develop where none existed before. In the middle of the 19th century, this was treated as tradition. You did it the way it had always been done because that was how it was done. Partagas treated it as a question. He varied the timing. He varied the size of the piles. He changed how the leaf was handled and watched what came out the other side. He was doing something that sounds obvious now and was genuinely radical then. He was treating fermentation as a decision rather than a custom. That single shift in thinking is one of the reasons the premium cigar exists in the form we know today. He did something else too, and this one changed more than tobacco. Rolling cigars is skilled work, and it is also profoundly repetitive. A torcedor sits at a bench for 10 hours performing an intricate motion again and again.
It demands total concentration in the hands, and it leaves the mind completely empty. So Partagas hired a man to read aloud. He put a reader on a platform in the middle of the rolling floor, and that reader read newspapers and then novels out loud all day to hundreds of workers who could not stop to read for themselves. They called him the lector, and the idea spread from that factory to every serious cigar house in Havana, and it survives to this day. Think about what that actually created. A room full of people doing manual labor, absorbing literature and politics and news for 8 hours a day, every day, for years. Cuban rolling floors became some of the most informed workplaces in the Caribbean, and it happened because one factory owner decided that boredom was a production problem worth solving. Remember that idea. Knowledge put into people's heads while their hands are busy. It comes back at the end of this story in a way nobody could have predicted. By the 1860s, Partagas was one of the most respected names in Havana. The factory was enormous for its era. The tobacco came from his own plantations. The slogan was pure defiance, 4 words that translate roughly as Partagas and nothing else. And then, on a summer day in 1868, at the height of everything he had built, Jaime Partagás was shot near one of his own farms. He did not survive it. The crime was never solved. A suspect was arrested and, by most accounts, died in prison.
The story that has followed the brand for over 150 years is that it was a rivalry over a woman. That has never been proven. It remains what it has always been, a legend attached to an unsolved killing. What is documented is stranger.
Workers in the factory afterwards claimed to see him. Not metaphorically, they said the patron was still in the building. The story goes that it took a Catholic priest and a santera working together to finally settle the place. You can decide for yourself what to make of that, but it tells you something true about how completely one man's presence had filled that factory. His son took over, and within a few years the family sold the business. But before they did, the son published something that reads very strangely in hindsight. In 1871, he issued a public announcement introducing a patented box design and a trademark. The reason was simple. Counterfeit Partagas cigars were being manufactured in the United States, and the family wanted the world to know how to identify the real ones. Hold on to that. 3 years after the founder's death, the family was already fighting to protect the name against imitations made abroad, because a century later, the family that owned Partagas would be the ones making it abroad, and they would be completely within their rights. The factory passed to a banker who knew finance but not tobacco, and so he brought in people who did. And at the turn of the century, a Spaniard named Ramon Cifuentes acquired the company. The Cifuentes family would run Partagas for the next 60 years. Under them, it became one of the largest cigar operations in Cuba. By 1958, Partagas was second only to H. Upmann in exports, and it accounted for more than a quarter of every tobacco product Cuba sent abroad. They were, by any measure, at the top of the industry. 2 years later, it was gone. On the 15th of September, 1960, the Cuban government seized 16 cigar factories in a single day.
In the early evening, soldiers entered the H. Upmann factory, the home of Monte Cristo. An hour later, they walked beneath the Marquis of Partagas. The man who ran it was inside. He recalled, decades afterwards, that they told him they were there to intervene in the company, and that they did not allow him to take anything with him. 60 years of family stewardship, 115 years of the brand, ended in an evening. Then he was offered something remarkable. The new government asked him to run the entire state tobacco monopoly, not just Partagas, all of it, every brand, every factory, the whole industry. He said no. Think carefully about that decision, because everything that follows depends on it. He could have stayed in Havana, in the building his family had owned, surrounded by the tobacco he understood better than almost anyone alive, and he would have been an employee of the state, making cigars under someone else's authority. Or he could leave with nothing. He left with nothing. The standard account is that he arrived in the United States with little more than the clothes he was wearing, and he never saw Cuba again. Except he hadn't actually left with nothing. He just didn't know it yet. For years he worked in the American cigar industry, and eventually he came to know a man named Edgar Cullman, who owned General Cigar Company. The Cullman family had a peculiar asset. Since 1906, they had been growing tobacco in Connecticut from Cuban seed. So here were two things that fit together: a family with land and a man with knowledge. In 1971, they released a cigar called Macanudo. It became...
If Cifuentes could build a new brand from nothing, what could he do with the name he already owned? Because that was the thing. Cuba had taken the factory. Cuba had taken the land, the machinery, the humidors, the tobacco sitting in the aging rooms. But in the markets that never recognized the seizure, the Cifuentes family still legally held the name. In 1974, they made an agreement with General Cigar, and in the late 1970s, for the first time in history, a Partagas cigar was made outside Cuba. The first ones came from Jamaica. Within a few years, production moved to Santiago in the Dominican Republic, where it has stayed ever since. Now, the easy assumption is that this was an imitation, a man in exile trying to recreate what he'd lost. It wasn't, and the proof is in the wrapper. For the new Partagas, Cifuentes chose a wrapper grown in Cameroon in West Africa, not Connecticut, which his partner already had, not a Cuban seed substitute, Cameroon leaf, which is thin and toothy and carries a sweet, spicy character all its own. He chose it because he thought it was better. This was not a man building a copy. This was a man who had spent his entire life learning to judge tobacco, exercising that judgment freely, possibly for the first time. The result was not a Cuban cigar in exile. It was a different cigar, built by someone with Cuban knowledge, using the best leaf available to him anywhere in the world, Dominican and Mexican filler, Mexican binder, African wrapper. It sold in enormous numbers. By the end of the century, more than 12 million of them a year. Meanwhile, in Havana, the original factory never stopped.
The state enterprise kept producing Partagas under the original name in the original building from Cuban tobacco, full-bodied, earthy, powerful. The house character the brand had been known for since the 1800s. 2 cigars, 1 name, both continuous with 1845. Neither one counterfeit. And if you want to see the entire 150-year story compressed into a space smaller than your thumb, look at the bands. They use the same colors, red and gold, similar design. But where the Cuban band says Havana, the other one says a number, 1845. One of them claims the place, the other claims the year. And that is the honest answer to the question this documentary started with. There is no fake Partagas, because the two halves are not claiming the same thing. Cuba kept the address, the family kept the origin. Which brings us back to a factory floor in the 1860s, and a man reading a newspaper out loud to workers who couldn't read for themselves. The founder understood something that most owners never do, that the real value in a cigar factory isn't the building, and it isn't even the land. It's what is inside the people standing in it. A government can seize a factory. It did. It can take the plantations, the aging rooms, the tools, the inventory, and the name on the front of the building. What it cannot take is 50 years of accumulated judgment inside one man's head. The ability to know, by feel and by smell, which leaf will become something extraordinary and which will not. Ramon Cifuentes walked out of Havana in 1961 carrying nothing anyone could confiscate. And 30 years later, when he sat down for an interview in New York, he still believed he was going back.
He said it would happen soon. He said it with confidence. He died without seeing it. But the cigar he built in exile is still made today, and the cigar that was taken from him is still made today. And both of them trace back to a Catalan teenager who walked into a tobacco field in 1831 and decided to learn. 2 cigars, 1 name, and a lesson that took 180 years to fully reveal itself. Property can be taken. Knowledge walks out the door with you.